Hi all, happy December, and thank you so much for joining us today for our fourth session in the Hidden Narrative series. I'm Fatima Qureshi, I'm the co-lead of DE&I at Edelman London, and along with my colleagues Marie Montu and Vian Sumbu, we set up these sessions last year to help us discover and discuss Black British history and issues related to systemic racism in the UK. The purpose was to better understand the world around us and to create a more just society. And the session today, Policing in Black Communities in the UK, is a really important conversation and also a really poignant one, because systemic inequities in the police and justice system that have historically prompted ill treatment of Black communities is sort of what prompted the need for the Hidden Narrative series in the first instance. I am, of course, talking about the horrific murder of George Floyd in the States last summer. It was an event which sparked a movement across the world, including here in the UK, a particular moment in time that I think shifted discourse around systemic racism from the sidelines and really brought it into the mainstream. There was a real outpouring of anger and a public acknowledgement of the really real and dangerous inequalities that exist in our society on a level that I've never personally experienced or encountered before. And one of the particular debates that was happening at the time, and is still happening now, was around the issue of discrimination against Black communities by the police and within the justice system in the UK. And I think the tragic murder of Sarah Everard earlier in the year prompted a sort of renewed focus on the role that the police play in our societies and questioning the powers that they sometimes hold. And I think simultaneously, that outpouring of criticism against the police in that particular case raised more questions on what injustices we focus on and why as a society. And it's not surprising to me that some people from Black communities were questioning why society was now taking seriously an issue that they had been highlighting and fighting against for a very, very long time. So our session today is not only going to look at the very real issue that definitely does exist and challenge some of those still held assumptions that this is an issue across the pond, but not here. But we're also going to look at the future, think about what needs to change and how. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker today, Abimbola Johnson, who will be in conversation with Via. Abimbola is a criminal defence barrister who's recently appointed chair of a new independent scrutiny and oversight board for the National Police Chiefs Council to help tackle lower levels of confidence between Black communities and the police. A winner of the 2018 Diversity Legal Awards Rising Star Award and a finalist in the 2018 Black British Business Awards, Abby's practice focuses on serious crime, professional discipline and inquiry work. So without further ado, over to you, Via and Abby.
Hi everyone. My name is Vian Sumbu and I'm in the corporate reputation team here at Edelman London. And I just wanted to welcome you all to what is essentially a crucial discussion and what will hopefully be an insightful discussion into policing and the justice system and what more we can do either as PR professionals or as normal citizens. And huge thank you to Abimbola for joining us this evening. We're keen for this to be a conversation. We're keen for this to be as interactive as possible. So in the chat function below, please share any of the questions you may have ever had about policing in this country, especially as it relates to Black communities and communities of colour. And we will be answering them throughout the 40 minutes we have with a direct discussion with Abby, and then following in a dedicated Q&A session after this. So thank you, Abby, for joining us. Perhaps to kick off, as Fatima highlighted at the beginning, we're keen for this to be rooted very much in the Black British and British and UK experience. A lot of when people are discussing these issues, issues relating to policing and Black communities, they always point to the US. There's always an assertion that this is a US problem rather than it being a UK problem. And if they do mention the UK, the belief is that a lot of these issues have been mostly solved following the Macpherson inquiry, following the murder of Stephen Lawrence. So keen to hear from you why this discussion is important and whether we've made any progress as a society, as a UK society, since the murder of Stephen Lawrence.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for, first of all, just for having me here today. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. And like Via has said, I'd really encourage everyone to ask as many questions as possible. I don't know if I can answer every question that you have in relation to Black communities and policing, as Via has said, but I'll definitely do my best. So going to the first question that you've asked me there, Via, here is a slide I prepared earlier. So we're going to talk in general about policing and Black communities. Can I just say from the outset, sometimes in terms of the reference points that I have, I've had to use terminology such as BAME or BME, simply because we're looking at data over a significant period of time, and unfortunately, the data isn't as granular as it needs to be when we're looking at some of the more historic reference points that we have. So when you do see me using BME in these slides, it's deliberate. It's because often there isn't the reference point that specifies just Black communities. What I would say is that across pretty much every data point, Black communities are at the sharp end of any of those references. So when I say BME, in your mind, just bear in mind that actually the experiences for Black people are very often even worse than that grouping of data would reflect. So you asked me whether there have been improvements since the Macpherson report. So let's go to the Macpherson report and remind ourselves of the definition that came out of that from Sir William Macpherson around the meaning of institutional racism. And this is often a topic that I think can become quite controversial in terms of speaking. We've heard, for example, with the CRED report that came out last year in terms of racism in Britain, that they veered away from that application of that definition of institutional racism to experiences in the country. And also you very often hear from senior police officers a reticence to accept or to acknowledge the presence of institutional racism in policing. But the actual definition itself, I think, is very nuanced. And I think it really highlights this idea that racism is built into processes rather than being those specific individualized decisions that are based on an intentional use of harm or violence against a person because of their skin color or ethnicity. So it's the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin. And it can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racial stereotyping. And so really what is being emphasised here by Sir William is that these are matters which, even if you were to follow the rules to the absolute letter, you may find that you still see racial disparity in terms of the outcomes because the rules themselves emphasise discrimination. And in terms of that relevance today, luckily or helpfully, there was a Macpherson 22 years on report which came from the Home Affairs Select Committee headed by Yvette Cooper. And that was a cross-party effort, which was made to look at the 70 recommendations that came out of the Macpherson report and to consider where we are in policing today. And what they said there about that definition of institutional racism was that they believe that the concept as set out in Macpherson remains extremely important, that institutions must be able to challenge themselves and be held publicly to account over inequalities and outcomes and racism manifested through policies and procedures as well as individual attitudes. So although they didn't go as far as to say we still think that the police are institutionally racist, what they certainly said was that is a really useful definition and that encapsulates the way in which we should be approaching discussions around racism. We should be looking at those processes. And the report highlighted 5 areas of concern when it comes to policing in Black communities in the UK. So the first being confidence in policing amongst Black communities. The second being the treatment of racist incidents and victims of crime. The third, the treatment of Black police officers. The fourth, the area of stop and search and actually use of powers in general. And then lastly, the use of police technology and tools. And so amongst those 5 areas, we still see quite a lot of racial disparity. And again, we're talking about the UK, we're not talking about the US, we're talking about our home country and the experiences of Black people in those communities. So I can go into some detail around each of those 5 areas and delve into the disparities that we see. But the short answer to your question, Dia, is it's still very relevant today. Broadly, the areas which are highlighted in the Macpherson report some 22 years ago still demonstrate disparities in policing now. It's very real in terms of an issue, and it's cultural. So it's something that really needs to be tackled in terms of really, I think, reconsidering our general approach to policing as a whole and being less defensive over criticisms that we may have or of specific powers that we're just very used to seeing being used, like stop and search, and questioning what we mean when we say, or when we hear rather, police officers saying that it's an effective tool. What is the aim of stop and search? What is it actually geared towards? Why do we see those racial disparities within it, and so on? And why is the government using the narrative, for example, of knife crime to justify the widening of the use of stop and search? Is that actually what stop and search is about? So those are the sorts of areas that we can hopefully explore over the course of this session.
Thank you so much. And this is, so I hadn't been aware of these 5 key points highlighted by the Home Affairs Select Committee, and stop and search is the one that is widely spoken about, whether that be in press or whether that be on social media. And the merits have been argued by the government, and the other side has also argued why stop and search is discriminatory. So as well as going into why stop and search has its issues and has its flaws, I think what was of most surprise in this list was the treatment of Black police officers. I'm not sure why that was a surprise, but it was a surprise that the Select Committee would choose that as one of the key points. So if you were able to delve more into that, and I think also the first point about police confidence, so the confidence of the Black community and other communities of colour in the police and how that impacts that. And I know that as chair of the Independent Oversight and Scrutiny Board, that's one of the things you're going to be looking at. So those 3 areas.
Yeah, okay, so I can take this actually quite quickly to go through the first few areas. So dealing with confidence in policing amongst Black communities. So the national average in terms of people who have confidence, so most people do have confidence in the police. So 74% of people say that they have confidence in the police, that they trust that the police are working towards a sort of greater good, and so on. However, when you then look at the Black community groups which are within those statistics, you can see that they are below the national average, and more to the point, actually, they are moving further down as the trend is that it's lessening, and the gap, the confidence gap between, for example, white members of the public and Black members of the public is only widening. So 69% of Black Africans have confidence in police. 62% of people who fit into Black other groups, so i.e. neither Black African nor Black Caribbean in terms of how they self-identify, and then 54% of Black Caribbean heritage people reported that they have confidence in the police. There's obviously that confidence gap. Then the other area that I highlighted was the racist incidents and the victims of crime. And the Home Affairs Committee report found that victims of hate crimes are less likely to feel that they're treated with respect by the police and less likely to be satisfied with the outcome of a policing investigation than victims of other types of criminality. And further, that in this age of social media, where very often the abuse that people experience comes online from anonymous accounts in ways that are really difficult to filter and to protect yourself from. And when you think about it, online abuse means that you could be in the sanctity of your own home and all of a sudden you're being called racial slurs, threats are being made towards you on the basis of your skin colour and so on. They found that the police really don't have the digital capacity, training, or the systems in place to keep up with both the monitoring and the charging of serious cases of racist and hate criminality that is committed in that online manner. So the police appear to be falling short of requirements when it comes to treating incidents of racism seriously. Then moving on to what we were talking about in terms of officers. So recruitment has been an issue which has been highlighted for decades in the police. It's really important in any profession to make sure that your workforce is as representative as possible. It means that you have a diversity of experience, that you have a range of thoughts and views that come into your workplace, and hopefully also, if you have them in the right positions as well, can influence the culture of that workplace, making it less likely that it would continue to emanate, to produce racist or racial disparity in terms of results. So I think in particular with areas like the wider criminal justice system and policing in particular, it's very, very important that the police force is representative. When you consider the range of power that the police have over the public, the fact that they have the ability to use force on people, that they can restrict their freedom of movement, that they can arrest them, that they can put their hands on people in the way that others cannot. It's really important that they have that diversity of thought across the workforce. Since the 1981 Scarman report, so since 40 years ago, that lack of representation in the police force, in the police service, I should say, has been highlighted time and again in report after report. And there were targets that were set out in the Macpherson report to try to push for the police force to become much more representative. However, what we have seen is that those targets have in some cases been completely dropped by some police forces. In others, there are attempts to meet them, but the progress has been very, very slow. And even when we do see recruitment of officers, it tends to be very bottom heavy. So it's very rare to find any Black police officers in senior positions. And as you can see at point 4 of this slide, Home Office data shows that at the end of March 2020, 30% of police forces had no Black British female police officers. So that's not even to say they didn't have any Black British female police officers in senior positions. They just didn't have any at all in 30% of police forces. So there's clearly an issue in terms of representation amongst the police. And we started to see last year members of the police being very, very outspoken around this. And significantly, a quote here that I have is from Neil Basu, who was the Metropolitan Police Assistant Commissioner at the time. And he said to Channel 4 News that it cannot be right that he is currently the highest ranking officer from an ethnic minority background in the police. And that's at the Assistant Commissioner level. There are no Black chief commissioners at the moment, police chiefs. We don't have any, and there has only been one historically. So there is not just an issue in terms of recruitment, but also in terms of retention of police officers and their progression. So there's this other aspect, and I know that this has been touched upon in some of the other series that you've had, in terms of the ability to bring your whole self to work. Even when you have Black officers in the police, are they being listened to? Are they able to push back when they experience racism? Are they able to influence the culture of policing if they're all going to be at these very kind of junior levels as we see here? So the target that was set for 2009, which was to have 7% BME representation, and again I'm using BME because that was the grouping that was used in the Macpherson report, that 7% wasn't met until March 2020, and even then that is still not representative nationally of people who come from BAME backgrounds, which was 14% at that time. And quite significantly, I think, when you look at that, what you're seeing is there's a difference in the rate of Black officers compared to, for example, officers from Asian backgrounds. So that BAME grouping actually masks the fact that specifically when it comes to Black recruitment into the police service, it's really wanting. And the last point that I have on here on this slide emphasises the fact that there are six police forces in England and Wales hadn't met the 10-year recruitment targets that they were set 22 years ago. Metropolitan Police, so the biggest police force in England and Wales, hadn't met it. West Midlands Police, which is the second biggest police force, then West Yorkshire, Leicestershire, Northamptonshire and Cleveland. And I believe, if memory serves, that Greater Manchester Police hadn't had their data together in time. So it's not a case of them having met it, but it wasn't actually known at that specific time whether or not they had. So there are those concerns there around just initial recruitment of officers. But then when those officers then make it into the police service, the experience that they have is worse than their white counterparts. The most recent Home Office figures show that BME, so again, we're going back to that BME moniker, were more than twice as likely to exit the police force through dismissal than white, and over 1.5 times more likely to resign. And then what was really interesting was that when the Mayor of London's police office had a look at those figures, they found that there's no disproportionality gap in the number of public complaints that are made against BAME officers compared to white officers. So even though there are similar levels of complaints across the racial groups, the BAME officers are still more likely to be the ones who are disciplined to the more severe end of the spectrum, despite the lack of kind of disparity. So it's not a case of BAME officers being worse than white officers. It appears to be a case of them being treated more harshly. And there isn't really enough data that has delved into why this is, what these trends indicate, and what can be done to change this. So that's to do with the interaction there between the police service and, for example, the IOPC, which is in charge of independent police and complaints being made. So those are the kind of factors. So racist incidents, confidence, racist incidents, recruitment of officers, treatment of officers, before we even get to the use of stop and search, which is where very often these conversations concentrate on. So do you want me to talk about stop and search now?
Yes, please do. Because as you say, whenever people think about policing in the UK, whenever there's either political, media, community, kind of youth work level, whatever level it is, whenever there are discussions about policing and Black communities and communities of colour, the hot topic is stop and search and the merits of it and the kind of flaws within the stop and search system. So keen to understand your thoughts and background on how it works, or equally how it doesn't work.
So I think stop and search is a really important topic. And I think one of the reasons why it really grips the public interest is that very often that is the first physical interaction that a member of the public will have with a police officer. And secondly, another point to bear in mind, which I think is very often lost in conversations around this, is that the vast majority of people who are stopped and searched are let go, have no further action taken against them. So you can see there at point 2, 77% of stops and searches result in no further action being taken. So it's a tool which is used, which is quite invasive, and yet, is it really as effective as we believe it is? And therefore, on balance, is it worth the kind of community repercussions that we see ricocheting regarding the kind of perceived, or in fact, the real overuse of this power? So I started with this quote, which was in the British Journal of Criminology, and it was put together by a group of academics who looked at 10 years worth of data in relation to stop and search. And their research was repeated actually in the College of Policing's own journals and their websites. The College of Policing is the body that sets the standards for policing across the 43 police forces. And interestingly, they found that the effect of stop and search on crime is likely to be marginal at best. And while there is some association between stop and search and crime, particularly drug crime, claims that this is an effective way to control and deter offending seem misplaced. So that's the first point that I think needs to be considered, because very often when we hear senior members of police speak about stop and search openly, when people point out these disparities to them, the kind of like the first kind of thing that they say, almost like a knee-jerk reaction, is stop and search is a really effective policing tool when it's used correctly, when it's evidence-based and so on. And so, okay, let's go into that. We see that Black and Black British people are still this year. So Home Office data came out just last week, 2 weeks ago, which confirmed this, that they are still 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched than their white counterparts. As I said, the vast majority result in no further action being taken. So that's, when I say no further action, by the way, I mean not even words of advice being provided by a police officer to that person, because that could be recorded as an action. So literally nothing. So 77% of those interactions result in that. In only 2% of stop and searches have we seen weapons being seized, and 69% of those searches are drug related. So this narrative that we often hear around stop and search being used to combat knife crime appears really to be, on the face of it, quite inaccurate, because first of all, that's not what it's geared towards. That's not the way that it's been used by police officers. They tend to use it in relation to drug related matters. And when it does result in weapon seizures, it's in a very, very small number of results of stop and searches. The Home Office's own studies have concluded that the effectiveness of stop and search estimated, it reduces the number of disruptable crimes by just 0.2%. So in terms of using it as a long-term crime reduction tool, that also like begs the question, well, where have they got this idea that it is an effective long-term tool? And a report from the College of Policing also concluded that that increasing powers to stop and search, which is another trend that we're seeing, in particular with the policing bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, which widens the use of stop and search and lowers the standards which need to be required before a blanket use of stop and search, that it occasionally is only occasionally followed by very slightly lower rates of crime. And they noted that those correlations even were inconsistent and weak. So this tool that is used so widely, particularly by the Metropolitan Police, that senior police officers will repeatedly say is this very necessary, very effective tool, particularly when it's evidence-led, is in fact not as evidentially based as it seems to be in terms of that assertion. Definitely, I think anecdotally, police officers are very beholden to it as a tactic. And I think I have to accept, and I think it's unrealistic to say that it doesn't have a place. Of course, if a police officer has a very kind of like good evidence-based reason to say that somebody that they are it was within their sight, or somebody that they could find very easily, is carrying, for example, a machete or a Rambo knife or some sort of weapon that they might use, or a large amount of drugs they want to take off the streets, they need to have an ability to seize that from that person. But as I've set out, that doesn't really appear to be the way in which it's used. And there was a recent report by the police kind of constabulary inspectorate body, HMICFRS is what they're called. And they looked at the kind of criminality priorities amongst the police forces. And what they found was that when you look at those, what a lot of them prioritize is the supply of drugs. However, when you look at the way that stop and search is used, what you're picking up are users of drugs. You're picking up drug possessors rather than drug suppliers. And so even when you move away from the kind of narrative that we often see in the media around stop and search, which is that it's this effective tool that's used for knife crime, even within the understanding of the police, which is that, you know, it's actually used for drugs, it's still not being targeted towards the areas that they themselves would prioritize. But what we do know is that it does have this very, very real effect in terms of undermining the relationship between members of communities and the police, particularly when you find people who are stopped and searched repeatedly. You know, we've heard stories over and over again of people who've been stopped 30, 40 times in their lifetimes, and very rarely are they of any other racial background than Black. And so I do think it's about time that policing starts to really consider the emphasis that's placed on this as a tool, and starts to look at the wider use or the wider availability of mechanisms that they can have. I think another point around stop and search is I think it really is like a short, sharp tool that is used to target specific moments in time, specific areas, to get items off of the street at that time. But if you use it over a long period of time in a community, it has that community effect in terms of the relationship, but also it just really displaces criminality. If you as a criminal are aware that a particular area is going to be frequented by officers who are going to use their stop and search powers, all you do is you'd pivot and you would direct your criminality to a different area. It doesn't stop people from accessing drugs or accessing weapons. It just stops them from, if it does, it would only stop them from carrying those items in that specific area at that specific time. And so longer term, in my opinion, police needs to start looking wider. It needs to start looking at why it is that people are turning to that type of criminality. What are the socio-economic reasons behind that? What are the investments which are available to people? Education, training, employment, housing, immigration status, youth clubs, programs around that sort of thing. And then if you use stop and search in that evidence-based and targeted way alongside that, then I think you'd see it being much more effective. And the other point to raise is, in terms of actual evidence-based stops and searches, i.e. when a police officer it's driven by intelligence, that's only 9% of stop and searches, according to Home Office data. So actually the vast majority of the time, even within the narrative that's being created by police, which is that it's an effective tool when it's intelligence-led, that again doesn't reflect the majority of the times that it's been used as a policing tool by police officers. So there's a lot to be said, I think, around exploring why stop and search is used in the way that it is. Which leads me on to another area around policing that I think really needs to be considered when we're talking about racial disparities, and that is the use of police technology, and in particular tools such as the gangs matrix, and also other matters like facial recognition software, which may be coming into use by policing in the near future. The gangs matrix was set up in 2011. I don't know if you remember this, Via, but we had the killing of Mark Duggan, and then the riots in Tottenham, which really spread across a lot of London, and in particular areas that had high ethnic minority community populations. And there was this real knee-jerk reaction that came from the government as a result. And 2011 was a really significant year for me, actually, because that was the year that I was called to the bar, and it was the year that I started my pupillage. And I started my pupillage in a set that did a mixture of prosecution and defence work. I now am at a set that only does defence work. But one of the ways in which I kind of cut my teeth, as we refer to it in the job, or one of the ways that I was introduced to a lot of cases, was through riot cases that my chambers at the time were prosecuting. And we saw real change in the way that evidence was presented, in particular with things like identification evidence. So all of a sudden, which is now quite normalized, but really this kind of came to the fore in 2011, you had police officers looking at quite grainy CCTV footage, and they were identifying people from CCTV footage of people who were rioting, and they would say, yes, that is this person, and I know that it's this person because I've had this number of interactions with them over X number of years, or I've seen them in the neighbourhood, I've seen them in the community, and so on. So you can imagine on a community level what sort of effect that had, because all of a sudden you had cases where you did have police officers who were known in the community, were suddenly using that intelligence or that information that they had to prosecute very often young people of these cases. You had quite severe sentences being handed down for relatively minor offences because they were committed in the context of these riots. But also you saw the creation of this tool, the gangs matrix. And what the gangs matrix was, it was set up in 2011 as an intelligence tool. And the idea was it was going to identify people who are at risk of committing or being a victim of gang-related violence in London. So that was the aim of the gangs matrix. Subsequently, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, he has acknowledged that the matrix has been controversial in some communities. It's resulted in mistrust of the police and in rising tensions. And I wanted to just give you guys some examples of how people could end up on the gangs matrix. If you have been stabbed, so if you have been a victim of crime, if you have been stabbed, and then, for example, you show reluctance to report that to the police, the fact that you are a victim of crime means that your name could be entered onto the gangs matrix. And what does it mean when you are entered onto the gangs matrix? We have seen evidence from investigations by charities such as Liberty and Amnesty that it can have an effect on people's ability to access local authority housing, that it can affect their ability to access certain types of benefits, and it can affect their employment prospects as well. But also, really importantly, it affects evidence in court. You started to see these statements which would come through from police officers, and they would use the fact that somebody was on the gangs matrix effectively as like bad character evidence to say, well, this is somebody who potentially has a propensity to commit this type of offence, you know, a drug matter or a case of violence and so on, because of the fact that they are on the gangs matrix. But then when you delved into the reason that they were on the gangs matrix, it was because they were a victim of crime previously, or because they had associated with certain people. Why did they associate with those people? Well, they were other boys, very often Black boys, who were local to their community, who they had grown up with, who they'd gone to school with, and so on. And so it's really highly racialized evidence that very often comes through the subjective decisions or conclusions made by people who look at circumstances of others, who lead lifestyles that are different to them, and they make judgments as to whether or not that amounts to them being somebody who ought to be entered onto this matrix. So there have been reviews of the tool. In October 2017, there were 3,806 people who were on the matrix. That reduced by March 2017 after reviews to 2,206. So that's almost a third, or over a third of people were removed from that once the names and the reasons were reviewed. 80% of people who are on the matrix are Black, and 12% are white. And I think, again, that points to some of the racialized understanding that we have of gangs. You know, we're very quick to look at people who commit offences in a group who are Black and label them as a gang, and slower to do so when we see similar behaviour amongst people from other groups, from other racial groups. When this was raised in the evidence phase for the Home Affairs Select Committee, assertions were made by the Metropolitan Police that the reasons behind that were that on a kind of like racial basis, you see higher levels of criminality amongst Black communities, particularly in London, when it comes to serious violence than you do for those who are from white backgrounds. But again, there's this real kind of opaqueness as to whether people who are on the gangs matrix are there because they are at risk of committing or being a victim of criminality. So there's that aspect of it too. And that was highlighted by Amnesty International. They raised the fact that one of the problems is that it's not very well defined, that the way that the gang term is placed, it's labelled on people. You can hear the word gang in all sorts of contexts. It's very racialised. And there is, it seems, however, a link between being on the matrix and coming off the matrix, and a reduction in criminality and offending, but also victimisation of those who are on it. However, there's no data available or no kind of review or analysis available to explain why that is. So we don't know if that is a causative or correlative relationship, if there are other things that are going on in the background and it's purely incidental that these are people who've featured on that spectrum of going around and being on the gangs matrix. But again, I think that reflects just this idea that there are all sorts of avenues by which we see this incidence of interaction between the police, members of Black communities, and the fact that they have quite testing and quite negative interactions as a result, and these like lasting effects that can take place. And the other aspect that needs to be borne in mind is how generational a lot of this harm is. And I think that that's the reason why when you look at the confidence data that I highlighted before, when you look at Black Caribbean groups who tend to have a longer generational link to being born and raised in Britain, they are the Black groups that have the lowest levels of confidence in policing, and also the lowest levels of trust in policing as well. Because the longer that they have been here, the more likely they are to have parents and grandparents and so on who had those repeated interactions with police, negative interactions with police. And so it becomes something which is ingrained in the way that they're brought up, rather than approaching the police from this sort of like fresh basis and interacting with them just on that sort of one-to-one individualized experience that they have with the police services. And so those are kind of like the wider, broader areas of concern that we see highlighted in the data and also anecdotally.
Thank you. And then just on this area of trust and confidence, because I think it's quite a big one, especially when it comes to whether these communities, when they're then in need, whether they will call whether they will go to the authorities, whether they will go to the police. Like if large portions of their community is on this gangs matrix due to racialized reasons, how confident are they then if they were stabbed, for instance? So in that example you used of someone getting stabbed and they ended up on the matrix, how confident are they then when they are in need of help from the authorities? Are there any data, is there any data on the consequences, like empirical data on the consequences of lack of trust on the police? And then kind of like on the flip side, what can be done to improve trust between the police and communities of colours, specifically the Black community?
Yeah, so in terms of data around sort of like the likelihood to call the police and so on, so there is a crime survey which is conducted every year by the Office of National Statistics, and one of the bases that they look at is whether people believe that the police are fair, as well as whether they have confidence. So it's confidence, trust, fairness of the police as well. And across all three metrics, you find that it's Black communities that have the lowest levels of belief in the kind of police service as a whole. So it's still, in some cases, it's still the majority, in some it falls even below 50% to say that. So yeah, so Black people looking at those metrics are generally less likely to call the police for assistance when they are the victims of crime. And that goes back to the slide that I had on there previously, which is that they are less likely to be satisfied with the outcome of the policing investigation than other victims of crime when it comes to matters which have a racist kind of skew towards them, but also, yes, in general. And I also think that something that's really interesting around a lot of this data, when we talk about stop and search and so on, and this idea that it's effective, something which needs to be borne in mind is, like I was saying before, the majority of people who are stopped and searched are people who don't then go on to even be arrested, let alone be charged for anything. And so the majority of people who are stopped and searched are people who are not defendants, who are completely innocent of anything. And it does have that kind of eroding, detrimental long-term effect on the willingness of people to speak to police officers. And just anecdotally, it's certainly something that I have seen in my profession. It's it's something that I hear police officers speak about from quite a frustrated perspective, but also that I see a lot of victims of criminality speak out about, that I'm sure many of us had come across instances where we see it's very often a Black mother kind of appealing to the community via television, asking people to come forward if they have witnessed something. And, it's very often people from Black communities who have that reluctance to come forward to speak to the police about what has taken place. So it does have that eroding effect. I actually wrote last year in The Guardian about a conversation that I had with my friends, and I thought that this was particularly poignant because this was a group of, like myself, pretty well-to-do, middle-class Black people, homeowners in our mid-30s. A lot of us are young parents with no criminal backgrounds. And one of our number a Black woman living in Brixton had seen an interaction she was worried was an instance of domestic violence, and the male and the female, the man and the women who were involved in that incident were Black. So a Black woman watching a potential domestic violence incident between a Black couple, she called the police because she was concerned about what she saw. And her husband's reaction was to question why she had gone so far as to ring the police. She then messaged our WhatsApp group to say, well, what do you guys think? And this is a WhatsApp group where most of us are Black within it, and if not Black, we're of other kind of like ethnic minority descent. And it was really mixed, but on a base level, we all understood her concern, his concern, and her kind of like hindsight of like doubting herself as to whether or not she had called the police. And a thread of concern that ran through the conversation was, will the police de-escalate that situation? Will they treat him fairly? Will he actually get like a fair process out of this? Or will they follow it through to the extent that they need to, so that the woman who's potentially in an abusive relationship will be properly protected if, for example, the prosecution didn't go anywhere? Or would he simply, be granted bail and allowed to go back to the house and cause more harm? Would they continue to prioritise her safety? So there was this concern that calling the police would only make matters worse. And so I just thought that's a very unique conversation that I only really have with my Black circle of friends. It's not a conversation that I would generally have with members of other ethnic backgrounds, and in particular with my white friends. And so, yeah, I think it does have this very real effect of eroding the trust in communities to the extent that it can prevent people from even calling the police when they themselves are a victim of criminality, or not really having much faith, if they did call the police, that there would be a positive outcome at the end of it.
Yeah. And then just taking a slightly separate looks, because one of the things we're looking at through the series is the role that different institutions, in this instance police, but one of the key ones, possibly because we're a PR agency, is the role of media and communications in Black communities. So in session number 3, we spoke to Dr. Francesca Sabande about the role of media in crafting and creating these perceptions and images of Black people, and the role that plays in wider society. I'd be quite keen to hear your thoughts on 2 separate things relating to media. So the first one, the interplay between media perceptions of Black people and how that then translates into the justice system. So when you were talking about stop and search, you mentioned that stop and search is such a hot topic because it's people's first experience of the police. But obviously beyond that, you have the judges, you have the courts, you have the lawyers. So how the perceptions created by media of Black communities has a role or interplays with the wider justice system. And then the second area is the role of media and communications in helping to tackle these issues. So what can we as PR consultants and comms consultants do to tackle these issues? And I ask this in relation to the disparity in the media treatment of the murder of Sarah Everard compared to the murders of Blessing Olusoga or Sabina Nessa or some of the other recent murders of women of colour.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll answer the latter question first, and then I'll go to the former. So I think that something that we need to accept in this country is that we, as Black people, are a small minority. And obviously, like being Londoners, we have a kind of skewed view of how much representation there is. 55% of the UK's Black population lives in London. So I think I think that there will always be a situation where our interests or our trauma is not prioritised in the same way that the trauma and the interests of our white counterparts are, because we are in that minority. However, that's not to say that things can't and shouldn't improve. They definitely should, but I just think that we need to acknowledge that there is that kind of back foot that we're already starting from. And you see it regularly. I mean, the examples that you've given are the very recent kind of like obvious overlaps that we can see between those cases. But like, cast your mind back like even further. And do you remember the case of baby P?
Yeah, and Victoria, Columbia at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these were these really awful stories about just horrific child abuse, where these two poor children, babies, were just treated horrendously by parents and guardians who had been entrusted with their care. And the media coverage over baby P was such that, you know, it was splashed across like the front page of every newspaper for ages, for weeks and weeks and months, as it should be when you have cases like that. Like, they should grip the public interest. It shows the media holding people to account. It shows the disgust that we have as a society over the treatment of the most vulnerable. In contrast, when it came to Victoria's case, that sort of came and went. And I think I could see at my young age that I could see that difference in that treatment. And so this is a trend which has been around for a really, really long time. And we've seen it more recently with the difference in terms of the media reaction, but not just the media reaction, the mainstream reaction of the public in relation to the murder of Sarah Everard and the killings, and then the subsequent police behaviour around Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman. And as you say, like Blessing Olusegun, and the fact that she she died, the circumstances around it were mysterious, were appalling, and the police response to her mother and to people who were kind of like tracing up details about it was quite dismissive initially. And it was only when key members of the public were able to draw attention to her case that the police kind of like reignited their interest in that and gave a much fuller explanation as to why they had come to conclusions they had, still not particularly satisfactory. So that is to say that the way that the media ought to treat those things is as equal, and they ought to be able to better enunciate and to identify what the contentious points are. If the media had taken the interest in the concerns that Black communities had around policing and disproportionality and the kind of abuse of power that you can see from the police, and the need to, for example, push for body-worn cameras to be used during stop and search interactions, the need for the police to better explain their powers, the fact that we shouldn't just trust that police officers will act within the remit of their power and not have anything in the system to hold them to account, because it's, you know, a small step for a police officer to abuse their power, as we saw with Wayne Couzens. All of those were points which were called for by Black communities for a very, very long time, and some of those points were listened to, some of those checks and balances were introduced as a result of those calls. But it really took the murder of Sarah Everard before a lot of those points were properly prioritised in the mainstream media. And so what would be wonderful to see would be for the media to listen to Black communities when they raise concerns around racial disparity, and for it not to have to take somebody who is white and attractive for that to happen to, prior to it like really gripping kind of national interest. But it plays into that other question, doesn't it, of does the media guide national interest, or does national interest guide the media? Because I think the other side of that was, following the murder of Sarah Everard, we saw that kind of uproar, and we saw that groundswell of movement from mostly women, some men as well, pushing back, protesting, highlighting how heavy-handed the police were in relation to their protests and so on. And, that was because they saw somebody who really looked like them and they could put themselves in that person's shoes. And I think that that's a really human reaction to situations. And I had some really frank discussions with some of my white female friends around how, if they were being completely honest with themselves, and these were their words and not mine, that the murder of Sarah Everard meant that they could finally understand the kind of like guttural emotional reaction that I and some of their other Black friends had to the killing of George Floyd. So it takes, I think, sometimes we're tribal people, it takes sometimes seeing somebody that you can relate to before you can really understand the experiences of others. And so I think that is an argument for why we need diversity. That's an argument as to why we need media rooms to be more representative, so that you have journalists who can understand those reactions being the ones that guide the news stories and give it the level of investigation and thought and nuance that is needed to report it in a much more kind of like sensitive and prioritized manner when we see people from Black communities being treated in the way that they do by those who hold positions of power. And if we did that more, then maybe we would see those better reactions from the media. I think the first question that you asked me was around, what was the first question you asked me, Mia?
No problem at all. I think I've also momentarily forgotten my first question, but I think it was relating to how media perceptions of Black people, so the images that the media, whether that be online, films, TV, whatever, music, have created these images, often very narrow images of Black communities and Black people, and how this plays out in the wider justice system. So the police are only the beginning of a person's journey navigating the justice system. So how does it play? How do these perceptions play out in the court with lawyers? And I'm going to use the example I saw you use like many years ago about a defendant who used "allow it," for instance, and how having someone who, well, I'll let you tell the story.
Yeah. So I think actually there's like a few points there. So the first point around like how does media perceptions and so on, how can it actually like affect the way that the general population sees Black people? I think that it was covered beautifully in one of your earlier sessions that media portrayal of people really does affect that, in particular when you consider this quote that I'll bring up now from Paul Wilson when he was giving evidence to the Macpherson inquiry. He was a member of the Metropolitan Black Police Association. He was the chair at the time, and he said this, and I think this applies to so many different industries. Given the fact that these predominantly white officers only meet members of the Black community in confrontational situations, they tend to stereotype Black people in general. This could lead to all sorts of negative views and assumptions about Black people. So we shouldn't underestimate the occupational culture within the police service as being a primary source of institutional racism in the way that we differently treat Black people. Interestingly, I say we, because there's no marked difference between Black and white in the force, essentially. We're all consumed by this occupational culture. Some of us think that we rise above it on some occasions, but generally speaking, we tend to conform to the norms of this occupational culture, which we say is an all-powerful in shaping our views and perceptions of a particular community. So what he's emphasizing there is that if the culture is influenced by whiteness, and if whiteness is so used to othering Black experiences, it will become quite lazy and rely on these harmful stereotypes around Black people. And if you're only interacting with Black people as suspects, as defendants, as victims of like really severe acts of violence and criminality, you effectively dehumanize them, and it becomes much easier to put people into certain boxes. And you definitely see that replicated in the criminal justice system. It's what led me to sit on an advisory board with the Howard League for Penal Reform around how you can be an anti-racist lawyer in the courtroom. And it goes back to what I was talking about with the 2011 riots and the way that we in the profession allowed that slip in terms of the standard of evidence which was being used, how we slipped into using very, very harsh sentences for minor levels of criminality for people who were very young at the time, which no doubt is having like detrimental effects on their employment prospects and so on. Once you go into the criminal justice system, it's very hard to get out of it. Our rate of reconviction of recidivism is quite high in this country, and so we should be slower as actors of the criminal justice system to allow people to enter as defendants and go on to be convicts, because the impact that has later on is so broad. And so, yeah, I think that we need to be very aware of the fact that the portrayal of people, of a group that overall is a very small minority of the population, if all that people are seeing are these kind of like negative stereotypes, if all that we are doing is pushing them towards these sort of dehumanized images, then it has very real effects. And we see it in other areas outside of the criminal justice system. So, for example, the statistic that Black women are, it was 5 times more, I believe it's now towards 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white counterparts. We see it in a lot of the literature around medical training, where people who work in the medical industry are told that Black people have a higher pain threshold, and that we are loud and more aggressive. So we also, not only do we have a higher pain threshold, we complain more as well, and therefore be slower to give us painkillers when we're in pain, or dismiss us when we talk about those matters. It's dangerous. It has dangerous effects. It can affect the way that we have access to healthcare. It can affect the way that we are treated by police officers. It affects us in education. We're more likely, especially Black Caribbeans, are more likely to be expelled, are more likely to be disciplined, and so on. So yeah, I think that it's all feeds into treatment by state institutions and by individuals and by organisations, and it's something that people need to be very conscious of when they come to conclusions around the way that people from specific racial backgrounds behave. That's why I say that there's no such thing as a positive racial stereotype. Once you start to stereotype people along racial lines in either direction, what you're doing is you are normalizing grouping people in a specific way because of their skin color. And so even if you're doing it from a positive basis, you're going to slip in towards doing it in a negative way as well. And sometimes those positive stereotypes have negative counterparts. So, you know, the idea that Black people are really good at sport and really good at dancing and really good at singing, but we're not stereotyped to be really bright or to be really hardworking or these other aspects, are we? And so actually that positive stereotype has negative effects as well. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, which is to say that, yeah, I think media portrayal, I think that these kind of like general aspects that allow stereotyping along racial lines, they have real harm, they exhibit real harm on people in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much. Well, actually at the end of our slot, but we have a couple of questions which I'm quite keen to ask you. So one of the questions from the audience is, this eroding effect that you spoke about is truly awful. How can I support my Black peers when dealing with or talking about the police, which I think fits in quite well with what you were saying about your discussions with your white friends following the murder of Sarah Everard. So how can allies, how can white people support their Black peers when dealing with or talking about the police?
So I think that there's a number of ways. I think one big way, one general way, is to start to engage with the idea that we have elected officials who are in place to be a check and balance on the police, and they are our police and crime commissioners. So, for example, I think a lot of people are not aware of the fact that one of the hats that Sadiq Khan has as Mayor of London is that he is the Police and Crime Commissioner for London. So in other words, he has the power to hold the Metropolitan Police to account. So if you don't like the way that, for example, Prester Dick, who is the Chief Constable or our equivalent of Chief Constable of the Police Service for London, if you don't like the way that she behaves, if you hear your Black friends, for example, complaining about the rhetoric which is used by the Metropolitan Police in terms of racial disparity, if you think they're falling short, then a way for you to actually make a difference is to push somebody like Sadiq Khan to hold her to account along those lines. So in the same way that you would with your MP, and you would consider the way that they are running their kind of slate for general elections, consider the way that your local police and crime commissioner is running their slate for their elections as well. So the elections for this year have been and gone. I'll show you on here just a bit more information around police and crime commissioners. It was on the 6th of May that you voted for them. This graphic is quite blurry, but I think we'll be able to send around the presentation so you guys will be able to see the image a bit more clearly. But what they do is they fund crime prevention services. They have consultations with their electorate around what the local priorities ought to be. They have dedicated local victim support centre services. They set police budgets. They appoint the chief constable. They hold the chief constable to account. They have a lot of power. They can make referrals to the local inspectorate and so on, when they have concerns around the way that the police are behaving. So one way that you can support people is by using your power as a voter. So make sure that you are voting for people who have anti-racism as a priority in terms of the way that they do things. Another way is just to engage in general with what is going on with your local police services. The Metropolitan Police at the moment have a plan of action that they have introduced. So that's specific to the Metropolitan Police. They have an action plan that they have introduced around racism. At the same time, there is a national plan of action on inclusion and race, which I'm scrutinising in my role as chair, which is going to be rolled out across all 43 police forces. And so you can feed into that as well, and you can look at that, you can consider that, and you can use your voice, write letters, campaign and push for the right things to be prioritised along those lines. Another way to become kind of involved and to support is through, and I know that we said this a lot last year, but genuinely it is through reading, and it is through just understanding what the meaning of a lot of these things are. But so these reports, the Macpherson report, the Home Affairs Select Committee report, the Scarman report, they're all widely available, and they're time consuming, and sometimes they can be a bit kind of verbose. But I think it's really key to go to primary sources of information when we're talking about things like policing. So when we're talking about stop and search, for example, and you hear a police officer saying it's an effective tool, Google it. Like, is it an effective tool? Well, what does the Home Office's own study say? What does Liberty say? What does Amnesty say? Look at those rather than just accepting that information, because once you are more informed, you can vote better, you can hold people to account better, you can champion people better during conversations. Because very often when we talk about criminality, we effectively hear answers that run along the kind of like black on black crime narrative that we often hear. Oh, well, like black people are stopped and searched more in London because black people are 24 times more likely to be murdered using a knife. It's like, okay, cool, but stop and search only recovers 2% of knife, like only 2% of the time does it recover a weapon. So it's a false answer to that issue. And so I think just having that within your ream of knowledge is really useful. It means that your black friend, your black associate is not the person who is called upon to come up with those solutions or called upon to answer those questions. You can actually step in and you can say, well, I've read this and I understand that this is the issue, and what you're saying doesn't actually marry with the evidence, and so on. So things like that I think will make a huge difference. And I know that I would feel very well supported if I had a friend that was able to bring out those statistics during those conversations, rather than it being me that was relied on to do that. And that's me saying that as somebody who's a criminal defence barrister and who does this kind of work all the time. It can be repetitive, and it can be frankly quite uninteresting to always be the person who has to do that in those conversations. So yeah, I think that's a really good way to be supportive.
Absolutely, because the thing I always say is being a black person is like having multiple hats and having to do multiple roles. So you're doing the job of being you, the individual, and then you'll be doing the role of being a representative of a whole community, because people have such narrow conceptions of who we are as a community. And then you're doing a third role of kind of like being an advocate and having to do the fighting and having that multiple role is exhausting. But I don't want to wrap up on that. I don't want to wrap up on the exhaustion of being a Black individual. I want to leave and wrap up on some hope, which is linked to a question we've been asked. So how can Black communities begin to rebuild trust in an institution that has historically behaved in this way? And I think on the flip side, and slightly more nuanced, is how can the police rebuild trust in Black communities?
So I would say that, I've painted this picture of the kind of extent of racial disparity that we see across policing, but I would say it is getting better, and it's not good enough, nowhere near good enough, but it is getting better. And I think that also we are in a time where people just have higher expectations of the services that we ought to be provided with. Like, speaking to some senior police officers, they're telling me that they're interviewing candidates for the police, and they're being asked questions. The candidates are asking them questions around, like, what are your anti-racism goals? How are you going to ensure that I am culturally competent as well as like competent to the letter? So I think that there is a new generation and a current generation of police officers who recognise that for them to be a legitimate force, they need to have the trust of the communities that they serve, and that includes Black communities, particularly in like metropolitan areas like London, Birmingham, Manchester, and so on. They are incentivised to behave better. And that's not to say that every police officer gets it, but a lot of those who are in decision-making positions do really get it. And just to highlight what's going on at the moment with this police plan of action, I'll show you this here. I think that this statement will go further in years to come, but just to make you aware, like, this quote that I put on here came from the MPCC and from the College of Policing. Our vision is for a police service that is anti-racist and trusted by Black people. An anti-racist police service requires us to tackle racial disparities in policing proactively, not to exacerbate racial disparities that may exist elsewhere in society, and to be continually aware of issues of race and racism. And so, that statement came from the 43 police chiefs across England and Wales. It came from the body that monitors policing and sets the standards, the minimum standards for policing. They have used the term anti-racist there a number of times, racial disparity, racism. So they are stepping outside of their comfort zone, and they are pushing towards, like making themselves more accountable towards members of Black communities. They've set up this plan of action structure, which has 4 areas of concentration. So they're looking at internal culture and inclusivity. They're looking at the use of police powers. They're looking at community relations and engagement, and they're looking at protection from victimization. So they have acknowledged where those areas of weaknesses are in policing and where those kind of pressure points are, and they have assigned chief constables to each of those areas to make sure that they are being held accountable. They funded this programme, and they've appointed me as an independent chair. So this is my board, the Independent Scrutiny and Oversight Board. That's our website, and that's our social media handles on Twitter and on Instagram. And basically, my board's function is to look at the wording of the plan once it's done. It's not yet written, but to look at the wording of the plan, to consider whether the focus is in the right area, whether it's realistic, whether it's measurable, whether it's properly prioritised, and to hold them to account. And I've already started doing so. You guys may have seen recently, I was interviewed by Clive Murray from the BBC, who was presenting their summit that they had a couple of weeks ago with the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, Amanda Pearson. We spoke there about institutional racism. We spoke about whether who's leading in this programme and whether they are able to talk about racism in a way that's very meaningful, what priorities they're giving to Black communities and members of Black communities who are in the police service, who can actually tell them about the experiences that they have, as well as those who are external. I have a budget, so they're paying me to do this. They are paying my board members as well. And I think that it's really kind of easy to be very cynical about these things. I do have a level of cynicism around this, But at the same time, I can see that this is not something that would have been done a few years ago. You know, like just seeing the term anti-racism being used by the police is not something that would have been done previously. Just hearing people even entertain discussions around institutional racism is not something that would have been done a couple of years ago, let alone, you know, in the wake of like things like the Cred report, where they basically tried to undermine that as a useful kind of piece of terminology. So there are things being done. I think that we do have the sight of the police, we do have their attention, and I think that we do have their motivation to be better and to do better. Whether they will, time will tell, but certainly I'm going to be pushing them to improve. And if any of you guys are interested in the work that my board will be doing, we're going to be working in as transparent a way as possible to involve as many people as possible, to feed back on it, to provide us with insights, research. You know, you guys work in PR and comms and so on. So in terms of like pushing the media to report on these things much more responsibly, in terms of getting the right people in the room for the right occasions, there are things that people can do around this. And it's all about public accountability. It's independent of the government as well, so it's not going to be beholden to whatever is like the priority for a specific election. It's going to have the priority of the police for as long as it takes for them to achieve the goals that they have set out. So I'm hopeful. I think that things are going to improve because they need to. I don't know what pace it's going to improve at, but definitely I can say that over the last few years, this is the most hopeful I've been about the kind of like prospect that there are for policing to really tackle the issue of racism.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Abby. I certainly found that helpful, and I hope those who joined us this evening also found that to be helpful. So thank you so much. Abby's this session has been recorded, so it will be available on Edelman UK's website, so you can watch at your leisure. It's also available on our YouTube. And Abby, as with our other speakers from the Hidden Narratives series, will be providing a reading list. So a reading list of all of the essentials for understanding policing of Black communities in the UK. Well, thank you again for your time, Abby, and thank you all for joining from home. Bye.
Having me. Bye, guys.